I trudged through knee-deep snow, each step harder than the last. My bones ached from the December cold that cut through my uniform like it wasn't even there. France in '44 wasn't where any of us wanted to be, especially not lost in what was turning into the worst blizzard I'd seen since leaving the States. "Watch it," I called back to Edward, who had stumbled into my tracks. The kid was only 22, his face red and chapped from the wind. Up ahead, Andrew suddenly pitched sideways against a pine tree. The sergeant's knees buckled as he slid down the trunk, leaving a dark smear against the bark. The bandage wrapped around his torso was soaked through with blood again. "Need a minute?" Andrew mumbled, his Boston accent thicker than usual, as he pressed a hand to his side. His face had gone gray beneath his stubble, and the corners of his mouth were tinged blue. Aiden dropped down beside him, his wiry frame racked with uncontrollable shivers. His teeth chattered so hard, I worried they might crack. "Can't feel my feet anymore," he managed, tucking his hands into his armpits. Edward collapsed next to them, curling in on himself like a child. His lips were practically purple. "Just 5 minutes," he pleaded, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. Wayne pushed through the snow toward me, his unfolding a map that threatened to tear in the wind. He held it close to his face, using his body to shield it from the snow. "There's a farmhouse about half a mile northeast," he said, tapping a spot on the paper. "We can shelter there until morning or the storm passes." I nodded, too cold to speak more than necessary. The lieutenant looked nearly as bad as the rest of us, though he worked hard to hide it. His aristocratic features were pinched with cold, and ice had formed on his eyebrows. "Andrew can't go much further," I said, keeping my voice low so the others wouldn't hear. That shrapnel wound opened up again. Wayne's expression hardened. "Then we'd better move fast. Get them up." It took all three of us, me, Wayne, and Aiden, to get Andrew back on his feet. The sergeant was a big man, but he felt lighter than he should have. He'd lost too much blood. We pushed forward into the blinding white, the wind driving needles of ice into any exposed skin. I took point, breaking trail through drifts that sometimes reached my thighs. Behind me, Aiden helped Edward, while Wayne supported Andrew. The sound of their labored breathing pushed me forward when my own body wanted to quit. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 40 minutes. A dark shape materialized through the curtain of white. "There," I called back, pointing ahead to where the farmhouse should be. Relief surged through me, giving me a burst of energy to push the last 100 yards. That relief died when we got close enough to see what we'd reached. The farmhouse was little more than a shell. The roof had partially collapsed, and jagged holes gaped in the walls where artillery had torn through. "Jesus," Edward whispered as we stood there, staring at our salvation turned to ruin. I turned to Wayne, who was still supporting Andrew's weight. "We'll freeze in there," I said flatly. "No better than being outside." Wayne looked at the ruined structure, then at Andrew, whose eyes had gone glassy and unfocused. He nodded once. "We keep moving. There's a village marked another 2 miles east. If we can reach it." "If," I echoed. But there wasn't much choice. We either moved or died where we stood. I went to Andrew's other side and ducked under his arm. "Come on, Sarge, little bit further." His only response was a grunt as we started forward again. The storm was getting worse, the wind now blowing so hard that I could barely see Wayne, even though he was right beside me. Snow found its way inside my collar, melting and running in icy trickles down my back. My feet had gone from painful to numb, which I knew was dangerous. The light was fading fast. In another hour, we'd be stumbling blind through the forest. I forced myself to keep counting steps, to focus on anything except how much my body wanted to lie down in the snow and sleep. My vision started to blur at the edges. I blinked hard, trying to clear it, but the darkness kept creeping in. I wasn't sure if it was night falling or my consciousness slipping away. Then I saw it through a momentary break in the snowfall, a massive structure looming ahead, its silhouette too large and too perfect to be another ruined farmhouse. As we drew closer, details emerged that made me wonder if I was hallucinating. It was a chateau, enormous and elegant, with 3 stories of windows and an ornate facade. Most remarkably, it appeared completely undamaged, its stone walls intact and several windows glowing with warm, golden light. Smoke curled from multiple chimneys. I stopped dead in my tracks, forcing Wayne to halt beside me as we continued to support Andrew between us. "What is it?" Wayne asked, squinting through the snow. "That shouldn't be there," I said, fumbling with frozen fingers to pull out my own map. I checked our position against the landmarks we'd passed. "There's no chateau marked anywhere in this area." Wayne stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "Does it matter? There's shelter and probably people who can help Andrew." "But it's not on the map," I insisted. Something about the building's sudden appearance felt wrong. The war had taught me to trust my instincts, and right now they were screaming that something wasn't right. Wayne shook his head. "Maps aren't perfect, Padilla, especially not in this weather." He adjusted his grip on Andrew and started forward again, half dragging the now barely conscious sergeant toward the chateau. Aiden and Edward followed without hesitation, drawn by the promise of warmth. I stood alone in the snow for a moment longer, staring at the chateau. In the swirling white, it seemed to waver like a mirage, its proportions subtly wrong. Then Andrew made a pained sound that carried back to me on the wind, and I knew I had no choice. I tucked the map away and trudged after them, each step toward the chateau feeling heavier than all the miles we'd already covered. As I approached the grand entrance, where Wayne was already climbing the steps, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were making a terrible mistake. Wayne knocked on the massive oak door, which swung open immediately to reveal a woman standing in the entryway. She was beautiful in a way that didn't seem real. Tall and slender with perfect features, raven hair falling in elaborate curls, and eyes that shifted between blue and green as she moved her head in. Her dress belonged in a museum, a deep burgundy gown with intricate lace detailing that hugged her figure before flaring at the hips in the style of another century. "Welcome, soldiers," she said, her voice musical with a hint of a French accent. "I am Madame Opal Nguyen. Please come in from the cold." The others practically stumbled forward, drawn by the golden light and warmth spilling from inside. I stayed back, my boot hovering at the threshold as something cold settled in my gut that had nothing to do with the blizzard. Through the doorway, I caught sight of a crowded parlor. At least 20 people stood or sat in the space, all of them dressed in fancy clothes that didn't match any style I'd seen since arriving in Europe. Women wore high-neck dresses with bustles, and men in tailcoats with high collars, clothes from different decades, maybe even centuries. What struck me most was their stillness. Not one of them moved or spoke. They just stared at us with blank, unblinking eyes. I grabbed Aiden's sleeve as he stepped past me. "Wait," I whispered. "Something's not right about this place." Aiden pulled away, his gaze fixed on the roaring fireplace visible through an archway. "It's warm in there, Padilla. That's all I care about right now." He hurried inside, joining Edward and Andrew, who were already huddled near the flames. I reluctantly crossed the threshold, the weight of the staring guests' eyes following me as I moved. The wooden floor didn't creak under my boots, despite its apparent age. The air smelled of wood smoke, cinnamon, and something else. A sweet, cloying scent I couldn't identify. "Your friends are exhausted," Madame Nguyen said. Suddenly beside me, though I hadn't heard her approach. "You must all be starving as well. I've prepared supper in the dining room." She led us through the parlor, past the silent guests who parted without a word to let us through. Not one of them acknowledged us with more than their eyes. The dining room beyond was lit by a crystal chandelier that cast rainbow prisms across a long mahogany table. China plates, silver cutlery, and crystal glasses were arranged around steaming platters of food. Roasted meat, fresh bread, vegetables, and fruits that should have been impossible to find in war-torn France in winter. My squad mates fell upon the food like starving animals. Andrew, who had barely been conscious when we arrived, now tore into a chicken leg with renewed vigor. Wayne took the seat beside our hostess, his eyes never leaving her face. "How do you manage all this?" I asked, looking at the abundant spread. "The war has made supplies scarce everywhere." Madame Nguyen turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "The war has hardly touched us here," she said, her fingers trailing along the tablecloth. "We are self-sufficient." Her gaze shifted back to Wayne, who was watching her with naked admiration. "Isn't that right, Lieutenant?" "Yes," Wayne agreed immediately, though she hadn't actually told him anything to agree with. "It's remarkable." I took small bites of bread and meat, not trusting any of it despite my growling stomach. The food tasted real enough, better than anything I'd eaten since leaving home. But something about the entire situation felt wrong. The silent guests, the perfect food, the chateau that wasn't on our maps. After the meal, Madame Nguyen led us upstairs to a hallway lined with doors. "Each of you will have your own room tonight," she said. "A luxury after the hardships of your campaign, I'm sure." The others mumbled thanks as they were shown into rooms that looked more suited to a palace than a rural French chateau. Thick carpets, canopied beds, heavy curtains, and clean linens awaited each of them. Andrew disappeared into his room without a backward glance, his earlier pain apparently forgotten. Edward and Aidan were similarly enchanted, closing their doors with expressions of disbelief at their good fortune. Wayne lingered in the hallway with Madame Nguyen. She placed a hand on his arm, leaning close to whisper something that made him smile in a way I'd never seen before. "And for you, Private Padilla," she said, turning to me with that same cold smile. "This room at the end of the hall. I hope you find it to your liking." I thanked her out of habit, but once the others had retired and our hostess had glided away, I found myself unwilling to settle in. Instead, I began to explore the corridors of the chateau, moving quietly along the runner carpets that muffled my footsteps. The hallways twisted and turned in ways that defied the exterior dimensions of the building. Paintings hung on the walls, portraits of men and women in clothing from different eras, all with the same vacant stare I'd noticed on the parlor guests. Some of the frames held only darkness, as if the subjects had stepped away. I made my way back downstairs, drawn to the parlor where we'd first entered. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing the same scene as before. The guests stood or sat in exactly the same positions, not having moved an inch since our arrival. Not a single head turned as I entered. Not a single conversation paused. There was no conversation at all. Just eerie, perfect stillness. One woman in a blue dress from the early 1900s stood by the window, her gaze fixed on the glass, though nothing could be seen through it but darkness and swirling snow. A man in a World War I uniform stood at attention near the doorway, his medals catching the firelight. Neither acknowledged my presence. The wrongness of it all pressed against my chest like a physical weight. These weren't people at all. At least, not anymore. And we were trapped here with them, and with whatever Madame Nguyen truly was, as the blizzard raged outside. I continued exploring the chateau, noticing strange details throughout the building. The elegant hallways stretched in directions that didn't seem possible based on the exterior I'd seen. Something about the architecture felt wrong. Rooms connected in ways that defied the structure's outer dimensions. As I turned a corner, I spotted a grandfather clock standing against the wall. Its ornate brass pendulum hung motionless behind the glass case. The hands were frozen at midnight, and when I leaned closer to examine it, I noticed a thin layer of dust on the wooden casing, undisturbed for what looked like years. I tried to wind it, but the key wouldn't turn. Moving on, I pushed open the door to what appeared to be a guest bedroom. Unlike the immaculate hallways in the dining room where we'd eaten, this room was layered in dust. The four-poster bed had cobwebs stretching between its posts, and the vanity mirror was so clouded with grime I could barely make out my reflection. It made no sense. Why maintain parts of the chateau perfectly while leaving others to decay? I backed out and tried another door. More dust. The same signs of abandonment. Yet the rooms we'd been shown were pristine. The contrast nagged at me as I continued down the corridor. At the end of the hallway, I found a door that was slightly ajar. I pushed it open to reveal what looked like an unused study. A large desk sat beneath a window, with heavy curtains drawn closed. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes whose titles I couldn't read in the dim light. My attention was drawn to a glass display case against the far wall. I approached it slowly. The case contained military memorabilia from what looked like various time periods. Medals, insignia, and small weapons were arranged in neat rows. But one item made my blood run cold. In the center of the display lay a French infantry belt from the Napoleonic Wars, the blue fabric still visible despite the dried blood that covered much of its surface. The dark stains had long ago turned brown, but there was no mistaking what it was. Next to the belt, tucked into a corner of the case, was a yellowed piece of paper. I leaned closer and realized it was a handwritten note. The ink had faded, but I could still make out the date at the top. February 12th, 1815. The handwriting was small and cramped. 4 of us sought shelter from the storm. The woman welcomed us with food and warmth. By morning, I alone remained. The others vanished without trace. I write this warning before I, too. The note ended abruptly. My heart pounded in my chest as the similarities to our situation became clear. I needed to warn the others. We had to leave this place immediately. I hurried back through the winding hallways, trying to find my way to the parlor where I'd last seen my comrades. Making several wrong turns, I finally found the main staircase and descended quickly, nearly stumbling in my haste. The parlor was dimly lit by the dying fire when I entered. The scene before me stopped me in my tracks. My comrades were there, but something was terribly wrong. They sat in an unsettling stupor, their eyes open but unfocused. Lieutenant Wayne was seated on a small sofa with Madame Nguyen beside him. Her hand gripped his arm possessively, her long fingers wrapped around his wrist. He didn't seem to notice or care. His face showed no expression, as if he were in a trance. I looked at Sergeant Andrew, slumped in an armchair. His wound had stopped bleeding, which should have been good news, but his vacant eyes stared at nothing. The bandage on his side showed the dark stain of old blood, but no fresh red. He didn't acknowledge my presence when I entered. Across from Andrew Corporal Aidan and Private Edward lounged near the fire. They were unnaturally still, their chests barely rising with each shallow breath. Neither one blinked when I waved my hand in front of their faces. The silent guests from earlier stood at the edges of the room, watching with the same vacant expressions. "Sir," I said, approaching Wayne cautiously. "Lieutenant, we need to leave." He didn't respond. Madame Nguyen looked up at me, her lips curving into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Your friends are simply exhausted, Private," she said. "They need rest, as do you." "What have you done to them?" I asked, my hand instinctively reaching for the sidearm that wasn't there. "Nothing at all," she replied smoothly. "Now, why don't you return to your room? It's very late." I looked back at my comrades, trying to decide what to do. I couldn't carry all four of them out into the blizzard, and I had no way of knowing what was wrong with them. I needed time to think, to form a plan. "I'll check on you all in the morning," I said, loud enough for anyone still listening to hear me. I retreated from the parlor, feeling Madame Nguyen's eyes on my back as I left. I made my way upstairs to my assigned room at the end of the hall, closing and locking the door behind me. The room was lavish but cold despite the fire burning in the small fireplace. The canopied bed dominated the space, but I couldn't bring myself to lie in it. It felt like a coffin waiting to be closed. Instead, I sat in a chair by the fire, watching the flames and trying to make sense of what I'd discovered. The paintings on the walls seemed to follow my movements, the eyes of the subjects shifting slightly whenever I looked away. I told myself it was just my imagination, fueled by fear and exhaustion, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Eventually, fatigue won out. I moved to the bed, lying on top of the covers fully dressed, my boots still laced tight in case I needed to move quickly. I placed my helmet on the pillow beside me and kept my jacket buttoned. Sleep came in fitful bursts, filled with dreams of blood-stained uniforms and vacant eyes. I woke hours later to complete darkness. The fire had died, leaving the room in blackness so complete I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. But I wasn't alone. Even before my eyes adjusted, I sensed someone's presence in my room, standing silently at the foot of my bed. I saw a young woman in an early 1900s dress standing at the foot of my bed. Unlike the silent, vacant-eyed guests from the parlor, her eyes were wide and alert, filled with unmistakable fear and urgency. Her pale face contrasted with the dark shadows of the room, and she wore her hair pinned up in the style of a different era. The white, high-necked dress she wore had yellowed slightly with age, its lace collar framing a face that seemed to plead with me without words. When she noticed I was awake and looking at her, she became more animated. Her hands moved in frantic gestures toward the door of my room. I pushed myself up on my elbows, trying to understand what she wanted. With deliberate slowness, she drew one finger across her throat in a slicing motion. The meaning was clear. Death awaited. Before I could ask her anything, she backed away into the darkest corner of the room. I blinked, and she was gone, like she had never been there at all. Only the slight movement of the air remained where she had stood. I sat up fully, swinging my legs over the side of the bed. The cold air bit through my uniform as I stood, careful to make as little noise as possible. The warning seemed too urgent to ignore, too specific to dismiss as just another strange occurrence in this place. I crept to my door and eased it open, listening for any sound in the hallway. The corridor stretched empty in both directions, lit only by a few wall sconces that cast more shadows than light. Lieutenant Wayne's room was 2 doors down. I needed to check on him first. He was our commanding officer, and if anyone would know what to do, yes, it would be him. My footsteps were barely audible on the thick carpet as I made my way to his door. I knocked softly, then a little harder when no response came. After waiting several seconds, I tried the handle. It turned easily in my hand, and I pushed the door open. The room was empty. The bed looked like it had never been slept in, its covers still perfectly made. Wayne's pack sat untouched at the foot of the bed, but his weapon was nowhere to be seen. Neither was Wayne himself. I backed out of the room, a new sense of danger prickling at the back of my neck. If Wayne wasn't here, where was he? And what about the others? Andrew, Aiden, and Edward? Were they still in the stupor I'd seen them in earlier? The grand staircase creaked under my weight as I made my way downstairs. The main floor was much darker than it had been earlier, with only a few candles still burning in wall fixtures. I followed the dim light coming from the direction of the great hall, moving close to the wall where the floorboards were less likely to announce my presence. The scene in the great hall froze me in place. My comrades sat in a semicircle, as still as statues. Andrew's face had lost all its usual alertness, his eyes fixed straight ahead, seeing nothing. Aiden and Edward looked the same, breathing but empty, like shells of the men I knew. And at the center of this tableau sat Lieutenant Wayne, his military bearing completely gone, slumped forward like a puppet with cut strings. Standing over them was Madame Nguyen, except she wasn't the same woman who had welcomed us. She stood taller now, her frame stretching beyond normal human proportions. Her skin had taken on a waxy pallor that reflected the candlelight in ways that human skin should not. Her fingers, I had to blink to make sure I was seeing correctly, had elongated into tapered points that she now ran across Wayne's cheek in a mockery of affection. As I watched from the shadows of the doorway, she bent toward Wayne and smiled. The sight sent ice through my veins. Her teeth had changed, coming to points that no human mouth should contain, sharp and numerous, like a predator's. I backed away as quietly as I could, turning only when I was safely out of sight of the great hall. My mind raced. This was clearly not a normal situation. Not a normal house. Not a normal woman. Whatever Madame Nguyen was, she had done something to my comrades, and I needed to find a way to help them. I needed a weapon. My hand went automatically to where my rifle should have been strapped, but it was gone. I remembered placing it by my bed before lying down, but it must have been taken while I slept. My sidearm was missing too. I checked my holster only to find it empty. I moved through the chateau, searching room after room. Most were locked or empty. Finally, in what looked like a study or library, I found what I was looking for. A glass display case containing various weapons. Most were ceremonial or antique. But one caught my eye. An old pistol that looked like it might be from the First World War. The case wasn't locked. I lifted the glass top and took out the pistol, checking its mechanism. It was a German Luger, probably taken as a trophy. The action was stiff but functional. It wouldn't fire without ammunition, though, and I doubted there would be matching rounds nearby for such an old weapon. Then I remembered the rounds from my service pistol. They weren't the same caliber, but I pulled one from my pocket where I'd stored a few loose ones. I examined both carefully. By some stroke of luck, the dimensions were close. It wasn't ideal, but it might work in an emergency, and this certainly qualified as an emergency. I loaded the pistol with my own ammunition, working the action to chamber around. The weight of it in my hand gave me some comfort, though I knew one pistol against whatever waited in the great hall might not be enough. Still, it was better than nothing. With the loaded pistol held tight, I made my way back toward the great hall. Each step felt heavier than the last, like the house itself was trying to slow me down. The hallways seemed longer and more twisted than they had been just minutes ago, but I pushed forward. When I reached the entrance to the great hall again, the scene had changed. My squad members still sat with the same vacant expressions, but now they were completely surrounded. The silent guests from the parlor, all 20 or more of them, had formed a tight circle around my friends. They moved inward with a slow, inexorable pace, like vultures closing in on dying prey. And at the center of it all, Madame Nguyen stood with her hands raised as if conducting some terrible symphony. Her eyes met mine across the room, and I saw nothing human in them. They were black pits that seemed to draw in light rather than reflect it. Her smile widened, showing those pointed teeth again. I raised the pistol and stepped into the light. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice cracking the silence like a thunderclap. "Get away from them." The pistol felt heavy in my hands as I aimed it directly at Madame Nguyen's chest. My finger tensed on the trigger as the truth of our situation became crystal clear. We hadn't found shelter from the storm. We had walked straight into a trap. And whatever Madame Nguyen was, she wasn't human, and she never had been. I watched Opal turn toward me, her beautiful facade slipping to reveal something ancient and predatory beneath. The smooth perfection of her skin seemed to ripple, like a disguise that couldn't quite stay in place. Her eyes, which had appeared an alluring blue-green before, now held a hungry, calculating darkness that made me go cold. "Daryl," she said, my name curling from her lips, though I had never once introduced myself. "Your friends now belong to me." She pointed toward my vacant-eyed comrades with a graceful sweep of her arm. "And soon, you will too." The pistol felt heavy in my hand. I raised it, aiming directly at her heart, and pulled the trigger without hesitation. The sound blasted through the great hall, and I saw the impact tear through her dress, leaving a dark hole centered perfectly where her heart should be. But she didn't fall. She didn't even wobble. Instead, she looked down at the wound with mild curiosity, then back at me. Her red-painted lips curled into an amused smile. "Oh, my dear soldier," she said softly. "Did you think it would be that simple?" I stared as the wound began to close before my eyes. The torn fabric of her dress remained, but underneath, her flesh knit itself back together until no trace of injury remained. She laughed then, a sound like cracking ice, and I felt my courage drain away. What was she? Around us, the silent guests began to move. They stepped forward in unison, their movements stiff but deliberate. As they drew closer, I could see their faces clearly for the first time. The horror of recognition hit me like a physical blow. Their expressions, blank, vacant, devoid of will or thought, matched exactly what I'd seen on Wayne's face, on Andrew's, on Aiden's and Edward's. These weren't merely guests at some strange party. These were victims trapped here for how long? Decades? Centuries? A man wearing the tattered remains of a Napoleonic uniform. A woman in a dress from the early 1900s. A soldier in a German uniform from the Great War. All of them standing, watching, waiting, but no longer truly alive. I backed away, my pistol now useless in my hand. Opal took a step toward me, her movement suddenly too smooth, too fluid to be human. "You understand now," she said. It wasn't a question. I turned and ran. The corridors of the chateau twisted around me as I fled, never seeming to lead where I expected. Had this hallway been here before? Had that staircase always curved in that direction? I ran blindly, my boots pounding against the wooden floors, struggling to catch my breath. Behind me, Opal's laughter bounced off the walls, seeming to come from everywhere at once. It no longer sounded remotely human, a high, wild sound that cut through me like glass. "You cannot hide from me in my own home, Daryl," her voice called out, somehow right beside my ear, though I saw no one. "This place is part of me. I am part of it." I ducked through a doorway I hadn't seen before, finding myself in what appeared to be a study or library. Bookshelves lined the walls, and a large, ornate mirror hung above a marble fireplace. The room had only one door, the one I'd just come through. I slammed it shut behind me, dragging a heavy desk across the floor to barricade it. The wood screamed against the polished floor, but I managed to wedge it firmly against the door. It wouldn't hold her for long, but maybe it would give me time to think, to plan. My shoulder hurt where I'd been grazed by a bullet days ago, and my lungs burned from running. I turned in a circle, looking desperately for another exit, a weapon, anything that might help. The mirror caught my eye again. It was tall, reaching nearly from floor to ceiling, with an ornate golden frame carved with twisting vines and strange symbols. My reflection looked back at me, haggard, dirty, scared out of my mind. Behind me in the mirror, I could see only the empty room. A splintering crack made me whirl around. The door shuddered, the desk moving slightly with the impact. Another crack, and I saw the wood of the door itself begin to split. "Little soldier," Opal's voice came through the breaking door. But it was different now. Deeper, raspier, wrong. "Did you think a piece of wood would keep me out?" The door burst inward with a final crack, sending splinters flying across the room. The desk toppled onto its side, and Opal stepped through the ruined doorway. I couldn't hold back a gasp of horror. She had changed completely. Her limbs had grown longer, her fingers now ending in curved talons. Her skin had taken on a grayish cast, appearing almost see-through in places, with dark veins visible underneath. But it was her eyes that froze me in place. They were pitch black now, like holes cut into the fabric of reality. She wasn't even pretending to be human anymore. "Your fear is delicious," she hissed, her voice now a rasp that seemed to come from multiple throats at once. "Your soul will sustain me through another century, perhaps more. You have such vitality." She jumped forward with impossible speed, crossing the room in a blur. I threw myself sideways, crashing into the fireplace, barely avoiding her talons. My shoulders slammed into the ornate mirror above the mantel, and I heard the glass crack behind me. An idea, desperate, probably useless, but the only one I had, flashed through my mind. As Opal turned for another attack, I grabbed a poker from the fireplace and swung it with all my strength at the mirror. The glass shattered with a musical crash, fragments raining down around me. I seized the largest shard I could see, ignoring the way it cut into my palm. Opal lunged again. This time, I couldn't move fast enough. Her claws tore into my left shoulder, sending white-hot pain shooting down my arm. I cried out, but even as she drove me backward, I drove the mirror shard forward with my right hand, putting every bit of my remaining strength behind it. The jagged glass sank deep into her chest, where I had shot her before, where her heart should be. Opal shrieked with a sound that wasn't human. The noise tore through the air, vibrating the walls and making the floorboards under my feet tremble. It was high-pitched and ancient, like something from another world that had no business in ours. The mirror shard in my hand glowed blue where it had sunk into her flesh. Light pulsed outward from the wound, and cracks spread across her skin like a piece of porcelain dropped on concrete. The fissures crawled up her neck and across her face, blue light seeping through them. "What have you done?" she wailed, her voice distorted and breaking. Her fingers clutched at the shard, but she couldn't pull it out. Every time she touched it, more cracks appeared on her hands. "What have you done to me?" The entire chateau shuddered. A painting fell from the wall and smashed against the floor. Dust rained from the ceiling. The building was coming apart, and the longer Opal screamed, the worse it got. The tremors intensified until the desk that had been our barricade slid across the floor. I stumbled toward the doorway, giving her a wide berth. She didn't try to grab me. She couldn't. Her limbs were stiffening as the cracks spread, light pouring from every fissure. Her body was breaking down, turning brittle. I staggered past her into the corridor. The walls were cracking just like her skin, and chunks of plaster crashed down around me. A chandelier fell from the ceiling ahead, shattering into 1,000 pieces. I threw my arms up to protect my face from the spray of glass and kept moving. "Andrew, Aiden, Edward, Wayne." I shouted their names as I ran, my voice barely audible over the sound of the chateau tearing itself apart. I had to find them. I wasn't leaving without them. The corridor twisted and turned in ways that made no sense, just as it had when I'd been running from Opal. I took what I hoped was the route back to the Great Hall, dodging falling debris. A section of the ceiling gave way right in front of me. I jumped back just in time to avoid being crushed. "Anyone?" I called out. "Where are you guys?" The staircase was partially collapsed, but I managed to scramble down what was left of it. I ran toward the Great Hall, sure that's where my squad would be. They had to be there. I'd seen them there earlier, under her control. The hall was empty. The chairs where my friends had sat were vacant. No sign of Wayne, Andrew, Aiden, or Edward. Not even the silent guests remained. "No, no, no," I muttered, spinning around to check every corner. "Where are you?" A massive crack split the marble floor of the hall, and a roar like thunder filled the air as part of the ceiling caved in. I had seconds, maybe, before the whole place came down. I ran for the front entrance, leaping over fallen beams and skirting craters that opened in the floor. The huge oak doors were hanging off their hinges. I shoved through them and out into the cold night air. Behind me, with a sound like the world ending, the chateau collapsed in on itself. I ran through the snow, not stopping until I was a safe distance away. When I turned back, I watched as the towers crumbled and the walls fell inward. The chateau folded into itself like it was being devoured by a sinkhole, swallowed by the earth. I stood there until the last stone disappeared and the noise faded, leaving only the wind and the trees. My legs gave out, and I fell to my knees in the snow, exhausted and in pain. The claw mark on my shoulder burned, and my lungs ached from the cold air. "Wayne," I shouted one last time. "Andrew, Aiden, Edward." Only silence answered me. I don't remember much after that. I think I tried to walk back toward our lines, but in the darkness and the snow, I was completely lost. Eventually, I must have collapsed from cold and exhaustion. When morning came, I woke up half buried in snow. The storm had passed, leaving a clear blue sky. I sat up, wincing at the stiffness in my limbs, and looked around, trying to orient myself. I was in a small clearing surrounded by pine trees. The snow was pristine and undisturbed in every direction. I turned to look behind me, where the chateau should have been. There was nothing there. No rubble, no foundation, not even a depression in the snow. Just more untouched snowdrifts stretching between the trees. It was as if the chateau had never existed at all. I got to my feet and stumbled toward where I thought the entrance had been. The snow showed only my own footprints. I dug with my hands, thinking maybe it had been completely buried. But I found only earth beneath the snow. "This isn't possible," I said to the empty forest. It was here. It was right here. I spent what felt like hours searching the area, looking for any sign of the chateau or my missing squad. I found nothing. No evidence that any of it had happened. The only proof was the wound on my shoulder and the memories that refused to fade. Eventually, I picked a direction and started walking. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay there. The wound on my shoulder throbbed with each step, and hunger gnawed at my stomach. The sunlight reflecting off the snow hurt my eyes, and my thoughts felt scattered and confused. I don't know how long I wandered. Time seemed to blur. I remember walking through forests and fields, calling out names that no one answered, looking for landmarks that never appeared. They found me on the second day. A patrol from the 506th Infantry Regiment spotted me staggering through the trees. I was talking to myself when they approached, arguing with ghosts. "Private, what unit are you with?" one of them asked, gripping my arm to steady me. I told them everything, about the blizzard, getting separated from our regiment, finding the chateau, Madame Guyen, what she really was, and how the building had vanished. I described my squad in detail: Lieutenant Wayne Wallace, Sergeant Andrew Perry, Corporal Aidan Simmons, and Private Edward Russell. I begged them to help me search for my friends. The soldiers exchanged looks I recognized. They didn't believe me. One of them checked me for injuries and found the gashes on my shoulder. They weren't deep, but they were inflamed, and the skin around them was hot to the touch. "You've got a fever, Private," he said. "Let's get you back to the aid station." They took me to their camp and had a medic look at my wounds. I kept insisting we needed to go back and search for my squad, but they just nodded and wrote things down. Their commanding officer questioned me later that day. I told him the story again, desperate to make him understand. He listened patiently, then asked for the exact location. I gave him coordinates as best I could remember them. He promised they would send out search parties. They did. For 3 days, patrols combed the area I'd described. They found no trace of a chateau, not even a foundation, no sign of my missing squad. The snow had melted in patches, revealing bare ground beneath, but there was nothing to indicate that a massive structure had ever stood there. I wasn't with the search parties. They kept me at the aid station, treating my wounds and my combat fatigue, as they called it. They brought out maps of the area and showed me that there were no chateaus marked anywhere near where I claimed to have found one. After a week, I was transferred to a field hospital farther from the front. The report filed by the 506th stated that Lieutenant Wayne Wallace, Sergeant Andrew Perry, Corporal Aidan Simmons, and Private Edward Russell were missing in action, presumed killed during the offensive. I was the sole survivor of our squad, and my account was attributed to trauma, exposure, and combat fatigue. 2 weeks later, I was evacuated to a military hospital in England. The official diagnosis was combat fatigue with delusional episodes brought on by extreme stress and environmental exposure. They gave me pills that made me sleep and talked to me about accepting the loss of my squad. I stopped telling the story after a while. It did no good. No one believed me, and each time I recounted it, The memory of Opal's face cracking like porcelain and the sound of her inhuman shriek haunted me for days afterward. But I knew what I saw. What I experienced was real. My squad wasn't killed in the fighting. They were taken by something that shouldn't exist, in a place that vanished with the night. In England, lying in my hospital bed, I stared at my reflection in the small mirror on the wall opposite. For just a second, I thought I saw cracks spreading across its surface, glowing blue from within. I returned to France 5 years after the war ended, determined to prove my story. The doctors had called it trauma-induced psychosis, and the military had quietly discharged me after my recovery in that English hospital. Not a single person believed what had happened at the Chateau, especially when no records existed of such a place in the area where my squad had gone missing. The French countryside looked different in peacetime. Fields once scarred by mortar shells now grew tall with wheat and corn. Villages that had been reduced to rubble stood rebuilt, simple but sturdy. I traveled by bus from Paris to the general region where we had marched that December night, carrying only a small suitcase and the memories that had refused to fade. My first attempts at gathering information proved frustrating. The local mayor's office had no record of any chateau in the vicinity, and the older residents either shook their heads or gave me pitying looks when I described the massive structure with oak doors and the woman who lived there. Some thought I was another disturbed veteran. Others assumed I was drunk. After 3 days of fruitless questioning, I considered returning to America and accepting that perhaps the doctors had been right. On my 4th day in the region, I ventured further into the rural outskirts, where farms dotted the rolling landscape. The dirt road wound through a patch of forest that looked vaguely familiar, though I couldn't be certain. Snow had covered everything during that blizzard, transforming the landscape into something alien and hostile. That's when I met Frederick Reed. He was working in a field beside his small farmhouse, his weathered hands pulling weeds from between rows of vegetables. I approached and asked the same questions I'd been asking for days, expecting another dismissal. "Excuse me, sir," I said in my limited French. "I'm looking for information about a chateau that stood in this area during the war." Frederick straightened up slowly, wincing at the effort it took his aging body. He studied me, his dark eyes narrowing beneath bushy white eyebrows. "You are American," he said in accented but understandable English. "A soldier, yes?" "I was. 101st Airborne." He nodded and gestured toward his house. "Come, we talk inside." The farmhouse was modest, but well kept. Frederick moved with the deliberate pace of age, his slight frame stooped from decades of agricultural labor. I noticed he was missing the index finger on his left hand as he poured us each a glass of homemade wine. "This chateau," he said, settling into a wooden chair across from me at his kitchen table. "You describe it to me." I told him everything I remembered. The massive oak doors, the ornate interior with its grand staircase, the roaring fireplace in the great hall, the long mahogany dining table. I described the woman who had welcomed us, careful not to mention the supernatural aspects of what had happened. Frederick's face grew increasingly grave as I spoke. When I finished, he crossed himself, a gesture that sent a chill through me. "Chateau WWII," he said quietly. "My grandfather told stories of it. My great-grandfather saw it with his own eyes as a boy." My heart rate picked up. So, it was real? It existed? Oh, yes. It was built by a man named Blake Nguyen for his wife Opal in the 1780s. He was a wealthy merchant who made his fortune in trade between France and Vietnam. They say he loved her beyond reason. "What happened to them?" I asked, leaning forward. Frederick took a slow sip of his wine. "Blake died during the Revolution. Executed, they say, though the records are unclear. After his death, Opal remained in the chateau alone. This is when the stories began. What stories? The locals spoke of strange lights at night, of music when there should have been none. Some claimed Opal practiced dark magic, learned from her grandmother in Vietnam. They said she hosted parties where guests arrived but were never seen leaving. I felt a cold sweat breaking out across my back. And the chateau itself? What happened to it? Frederick's eyes met mine. This is why I knew you were not making up stories. The chateau has not stood in that forest for over 100 years. According to local history, it vanished completely in 1843. Nothing has stood on that ground since. That's impossible, I whispered, though I knew better. Buildings don't just disappear. This one did. Many search parties tried to find it after reports of missing travelers in the area. They found nothing but empty forest where it once stood. I told Frederick about my squad then, about Andrew, Aiden, Edward, and Wayne, about how they had disappeared while I somehow escaped. He listened without interruption, his face solemn. "You are fortunate," he said when I finished. "Very few have encountered Chateau WWII and lived to speak of it." "Would you show me?" I asked. "Would you take me to where it stood?" Frederick hesitated, then nodded. "Tomorrow. It will be light longer, and the path is not easy for an old man." The next morning, Frederick led me through the forest. We walked slowly due to his age, following a path that had nearly been reclaimed by nature. After about an hour, we emerged into a large clearing surrounded by pine trees. "Here," Frederick said, stopping at the edge. "This is where it stood." The clearing was empty, except for tall grass and wildflowers. No foundation stones, no rubble, nothing to indicate a structure had ever been there. I walked into the center of the clearing, turning slowly, trying to orient myself based on my memories of that night. "Are you certain this is the place?" I asked. Frederick nodded. "My great-grandfather helped with one of the search parties. The descriptions have been passed down in my family." I spent hours searching the clearing that day, with Frederick sitting on a fallen log at the edge, watching me with patient eyes. As the afternoon began to wane, I was ready to admit defeat when my boot struck something solid in the tall grass. Kneeling down, I pushed aside the vegetation and found a single weathered marble step, half buried in the soil. It was cracked and worn by time, but unmistakably man-made. I brushed away dirt with my fingertips, revealing the faint outline of an ornate carving on its edge. "Frederick," I called out, my voice shaking. "Come look at this." He made his way over slowly and looked down at my discovery. "From the entrance, perhaps," he said quietly, "the only piece that remained in our world." "Our world?" I repeated. Frederick met my eyes. "Some things exist between places, young man, between what is real and what is not." I sat back on my heels, staring at the marble step. This small piece of stone validated everything. My memories, my nightmares, the fate of my friends. I took a photograph of it with the camera I'd brought, though I knew pictures would never capture what truly mattered. As the sun began to set, Frederick suggested we leave before darkness fell. I agreed, feeling suddenly exhausted by the weight of vindication. We began walking back toward the path, with me trailing a few steps behind the old farmer. That's when I saw her. At the far edge of the clearing, partially hidden among the trees, stood a female figure. She wore what looked like a white dress, her dark hair cascading around her shoulders. Even from a distance, I recognized the graceful posture, the tilt of her head. Opal. My body froze, unable to move or call out to Frederick. Opal's lips curved into a slight smile as our eyes met across the clearing. I blinked, my eyes watering from refusing to close them for too long, and in that split second, she vanished. The space between the trees was empty, with only mist curling through the underbrush. "Daryl?" Frederick called, having noticed I'd stopped walking. "Nothing," I said, hurrying to catch up with him. "Just thought I saw something." We didn't speak much on the way back to his farm. Before I left, Frederick pressed a small cloth bag into my hand. "Salt from the Dead Sea," he explained. "My grandmother taught me it offers protection against things that exist between worlds. Keep it with you." I thanked him and promised to write, though I never did. 2 days later, I boarded a plane back to America, carrying the photograph of the marble step and Frederick's pouch of salt. I never returned to France after that. The nightmares that had plagued me since my escape from the Chateau intensified, featuring Opal's face and her final words to me before I embedded the mirror shard in her flesh. Souls never truly escape my domain. Over the years, I moved several times, but maintained 2 constants in my life. I kept a loaded pistol in the drawer of my bedside table, and I covered or removed all mirrors in my bedroom before midnight. My wife thought these habits strange, but accepted them as the eccentricities of a man who had seen war. Only I knew they were precautions against a different kind of war. One fought against an enemy who existed outside the normal rules of life and death, and who had promised our battle was not truly over. The doctors told me I would eventually move past the trauma, that time would heal these psychological wounds. But some experiences change you forever. Some memories refuse to fade. And sometimes, when I wake in the darkness of night, I still hear Opal's laughter echoing through the corridors of my mind, reminding me that some chains can never be broken.